Welcome to the podcast. This is Full But Not Finished, and I'm your host, Stephanie Michelle. Today, I wanted to talk about my story because in all the years that I have been doing this, I have absolutely talked about my story in across hundreds of episodes in a former podcast that I hosted called Life After Diets. And on Instagram, I've shared things. In my groups, I've shared things, but I've never sat down and talked through my story from start to finish. And so for people who like to hear stories, because there's so much vulnerability in them. There's also a lot of times so much resonance in them. I wanted to have a place where I could point people to, or that you could just orient towards the things I've been through in case there are certain things I say that you might resonate with, or things that I've experienced that you have experienced too, to understand where I'm coming from and where my recovery came from and how that evolved. And maybe the ways in which even my own story has shaped the ways that I think about things now and the ways that you might think about things, or the way that you differ from, your experience might differ from mine. And that can help you understand what might be different for you as opposed to some of the ways I talk about things. I believe that's how we learn from each other, by comparing and contrasting. And so, I'm like, okay, now how am I going to do this? How am I going to talk about my story? Because it's such a long one and it's got so many inroads and outroads and tangents. I'm going to try really to contain myself here because I like a good tangent. Um, I want to start by talking about my introduction to dieting at a younger age. But I know too that for many of us, we don't arrive at that adolescent point or childhood moment of restricting or dieting in a vacuum. So there's always a story before the story. And in the name of time, I will just say that I am the oldest of three children. I have a sister who's a couple years younger than me, and then a brother who is 4 years younger than me. My parents were married, they never divorced, and there was a lot of volatility in my home. There was a lot of volume in my home. You may have heard me talk about my comfort with anger, which I hope to do a podcast on one of these days. I am really comfortable with anger because it's very familiar to me. I come from an Italian background, which I know is a bit of a stereotype, but a true one in this case, in that we yelled. Yelling was a huge, huge part of my upbringing, for better or for worse. And I, at this point in my life, can look back and understand that in some ways, the ways in which my family and I communicated with one another helped. There was a lot of communication, a lot of communication. We weren't a family that pushed things under the rug. We weren't a family where we would have like big things happen and then we'd never talk about it again. We were very much the opposite. We would overly discuss. We were overly enmeshed. We were over expressive to the point where, at times it became a question of like, where are my boundaries? Like, we feel at liberty to speak to one another about anything and everything with no holds barred. Again, there's a light side to that and a dark side to that. But the energy in my family was very fight or flight. And that might inform the way that I think about myself now and the way that I talk about the nervous system now, my anxiety now, because I often still to this day wonder if I was born that way or if my disposition is actually slower, but I have been sort of conditioned into a fight or flight response. I'm not really sure. But that was the background. That was the lay of the land. And in my home, my father was in charge and he believed in gender roles. He was a boomer in the boomer generation and very much a stereotypical product of that generation. And my mother was the quintessential housewife who took care of my dad, took care of us, just wanted to keep the peace and didn't necessarily have her own sense of boundaries around that. This isn't an issue of blaming anyone, and this is not an exploration into my family dynamics either, but that is the backdrop. Another important thing to note, it feels like, is that my father was constantly struggling with his size. I don't think he would call himself a binge eater. He didn't eat in secret. He didn't feel he had anything to hide. My father was never outwardly ever self-conscious about his size. He was a plus size man. He was a lot of times on, the Nutrisystem diet, and he was always doing fad diets to lose weight, but never did he speak of himself in a derogatory way. And he never talked about his body as being a barrier. My father was a very powerful man. He had a big job. He had a ton of friends. He was a very socially engaged, professional minded businessman. And I never got any messaging from him or any indication that he was ashamed of his size. However, he did have strong opinions about women and their size. And so when my mother, who is a straight size person who never really got into dieting, my mother doesn't have a strong diet culture influence on me. She had a typical one. I mean, it's not like she was absent of any, she makes fat phobic comments and she is just like the rest of culture influenced by it. But it wasn't something she ever pushed on me. And she didn't have her own prominent issues with her own body image more than what it would be typical. However, my father did used to pick on. He had things to say. He had opinions about my mother. And if she would sort of start creeping up and putting on a little more weight, he did have something to say about that. And I always thought that was so ironic because I was like, well, why is it okay for you, but not okay for mom? And the answer to that was because remember, we talked about everything. It wasn't like a question I kept inside. And I would ask, and he would say, because she's a woman. And in he didn't have to say much more than that. It was more like women are supposed to be attractive. This is their job. He didn't say it in those words, but he might as well have. So that's the place that I was coming from at the time when I started to think about dieting. And, I remember being 10 years old. I had a best friend named Katie. I think I've referenced her before on my other podcast. And she and I were taking a walk one day from her house to my house. And she said, my mom's on a diet. Do you want to go on a diet with me? And at the time, I was also, I wasn't a small child. I was never a petite bodied being. My genetic predisposition is just taller and broader. I have always had more curves. I have always had hips. I've always had a rear end. I've always had thighs. And my friend Katie and I both sort of commiserated with that. And so there was some body image insecurity brewing by the time I was 10 years old. And she had suggested going on a diet to me at 10. And I was like, great idea. And that was the first time I ever dieted. However, at that time, it wasn't more than child's play. It didn't turn into anything more major than that. But it did start sort of kick off this feeling of like, I'm a person who should be dieting. I'm the kind of body type that should diet. And so I would always talk about my weight in a pretty derogatory way after that. And I would reference myself with my other friends as like, oh, I'm fat. And I would sort of lament my body. And I blamed it in many cases, especially as I went through middle school, for like the reason why anything bad would happen, and I was a social kid. I did have a lot of friends. I was introverted always, and I was always on the shyer side, the more quiet side. I was always somebody who would observe, and not really, I definitely didn't talk as much as I talk now in public. But I always did have a lot of friends, but I still always felt that my friends had a better physique than me, and that was my area of concern. And that was the thing that kept me from, maybe I attribute it to being more extroverted. I don't know. I've always had a little bit of a pathology for my own introversion and feeling like, oh, you're too quiet, you're too shy, you don't speak up enough. And I think that I thought that was because you're not confident in your body. Perhaps. And maybe that had an element of truth, but I also think it's part of my disposition. And this is very much in line with my understanding now of accepting the things about us, or understanding that the things we have pathologized about ourselves and thought were wrong just because they were different from other people, what if they're not? But I digress. And so at this point in my life, there was no disorder really happening other than what is unfortunately normal. So through my teen years, again, I'm the oldest child. I did have perfectionism characteristics. I was a high achiever. I never thought I was good enough. All of those type A things. I actually have quite a type B in me as well, but it wasn't emerged yet. I have a very type A side and I have a very type B side. It's fascinating, actually. I'm confused by it all the time, but I can be either. And but at this time growing up, I was pretty much type A. That was my original code. And so around the backdrop of this time, there was a lot of turbulence going on at home. My father's started to get more stressed at work. There were things going on for him professionally that began to give him anxiety. He would never call it that, but his dysregulation, as I would put it now, became another family member. I mean, it was part of the environment of our home, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it was to the point where in our house, there was just constant fighting, constant noise and stimulation and emotional turbulence that nobody was taking accountability for. I didn't have parents who necessarily had the capacity to self-regulate. again, very much a product of the time. But as that was going on, I was in adolescence. This is the time where we're really figuring out who we are. We're developing our social circles. We're developing our sense of worth now, not only through our family system, but also through our peer system. And so I remember as we went through middle school and as my body image started to get worse and worse, my friends, like my best friends, they started dating. They started to get boyfriends. They started to become, that brink of like you leave childhood and you go into adolescence, and there's this coming of age that happens during this time. And I guess it's around the age of like 15 years old, 16 years old. And I remember feeling I wasn't ready for that. I remember feeling extremely resistant about this whole idea of growing up and dating and leaving the family unit. I didn't feel security, I don't think, in my family unit. And so to leave it felt premature to me. And lo and behold, my very best friend gets a boyfriend, and she starts spending a ton of time with him, whereas previously we had been pretty attached at the hip. And I remember it was that summer that I felt this sense of loneliness that was a perfect storm of actually feeling more lonely and actually feeling like my right-hand man now had another right-hand man, and that I didn't. I really felt that lack in myself. I felt this pull back towards childhood and the resistance about growing up. And I also had this high level of stimulation going on at home with a negative body image and an increase in objectification of my own, where I was starting to be noticed by boys at school, and I was not. I was really. It really rattled me. It really started to feel like it made me nervous. And so this summer, that the summer I turned right after I turned 15 years old, I started to diet in a more intentional way. And the more time I spent alone, which is what ended up happening, I started hibernating a lot that summer. I started running. I started then running morning, and then I started swimming in the afternoon. And I started to count my calories. And I remember my mom had this, remember the Joy of Cooking cookbook, that like red and white plaid book. It was like a hardcover, spiral bound cookbook that sat in our kitchen on a shelf. And at the back of the book, there was calorie counts of typical foods. I don't think I went looking for it, but I think that my mom must have had the cookbook out, and I was looking around and I found this calorie section in the back, and it became my Bible. That summer, I used that book day in and day out until by the end of the summer, I had it completely memorized. And that was the initiation of calorie counting. And I did have this idea of how many calories that I should be having in order to lose weight. And that was my target. And that was my obsession. So the entire summer, I tracked my calories and I had a ceiling for it. And on days where I found that I could come in under, and I remember specifically this one time, my grandmother was staying with us. I think my parents were away for a business trip for my father. And so it was like a weeknight. And I remember I came home from field hockey practice one day, and my grandmother was she was sitting on the couch in my family room, and she didn't move very easily. She had a lot of aches and pains, and she shouted to me from the family room, and she said, "Steph, your dinner's on the stove," or whatever. And I remember in that moment understanding, like, she's not going to come watch me eat this. And I took the dinner and I threw it in the garbage, and I was like, thanks. And I didn't have dinner that evening. And I didn't feel hungry for that. I felt powerful for that. I felt like I had just figured out that I had some agency, or I had some influence over my own life in a way where grown-ups weren't watching. And it gave me a high. And so that became kind of my modus operandi after that, like figuring out where were the places that I could get away with not eating, where people wouldn't necessarily notice. And that's essentially how it proceeded and developed into a highly restrictive ED. At this time, I was definitely dealing with hunger that I was overriding, but at this time, and because this was the first offense to my body, this was the first time that my body was actually feeling scarcity. Because prior to that, I'd been somebody, I'd always had a big appetite as a kid. I was never somebody who didn't want the snacks or the food. I had always eaten enough for sure. But I remember feeling hungry, and I remember having like feeling like it was a game, and feeling like, hey, I can feel hungry and override it. And like this was the ticket to me. And I have a journal somewhere where I wrote myself a note during that time, and I wrote it to a future version of myself. And it said something like, the next time you ever struggle with weight, this is the formula. These are the amounts of calories you need to have. Basically, just kind of telling myself, like, I've cracked the code. I don't know what you're confused about. This is what you have to do. It's basically just math. And I remember at the time feeling like this was so obvious. Like, why doesn't everybody do this? And I remember later in my life looking back at that journal entry and thinking the same thing. I remember thinking, why could I do it then and I can't do it now? This is going into the future when I couldn't tolerate doing that anymore. And I now understand that at that time when I was able to do it and it felt so obvious and easy to me, it was because my body wasn't yet rebelling. My body was still like, what? And so it was just sort of like going with it. It was in famine mode alongside of me and hadn't yet figured out or learned to speak back. And so the next several years went on. So this is basically my entire high school career. I lost more and more weight. At first, it was a note of like compliment. It was everybody was like, "Wow, like wow, you look great." Like there were lots of compliments. My parents didn't. I don't even remember, to be honest, if my parents said anything. They weren't concerned. Nobody was concerned because again, I was a big boned kid, right, or an adolescent, and so there was no concern coming from anyone. There was just a lot of congratulations. I was playing sports at the time. My times got faster. My game got better. I started getting a lot more attention from boys at school. I started having more social status. It looked on the outside and felt to me like, all right, I've arrived. Like this is the way to do it. Ironically, I was also feeling extraordinarily sad. I was crying a lot. I never felt happy. I thought, though, that was a completely separate thing. And I didn't understand because I was gaining all this traction in these areas, but personally and inside of myself just felt so hollow and so sad. I was sad all the time. I have a lot of like dark poetry from that time of my life. I was always a creative writer. And I would come home from school sometimes and I would just write these poems. Also became very highly attached to my high school crush and projected a lot of my worth onto the fact that, or a lot of my lack thereof, actually, of the fact that it wasn't a reciprocated crush. This was an unrequited love. And so none of this was I putting together in any kind of cohesive way, but I had this, these attachment wounds active, these loneliness. I think it was a lot hormonal as well. And a lot of this weight loss, but all of it was fueled by the energy of just keep calorie counting, just keep losing weight. At a certain point, my weight did start to drop below what even the BMI would call healthy for my height. However, by the time it actually got low enough to mark itself as dangerous on the growth chart, I was very deep into the disorder, going to show that disorder doesn't occur just because it's not just about the weight you're at. It's about the behaviors that precede it. And for my weight set point, which is going to be higher than average, and it still is, I had already dipped below, even though it wasn't showing up on the BMI necessarily, like I was under my weight set point. And then I was actually underneath what would have been an average weight set point for my height anyway. At this time, people started to question me. I had a friend whose mother approached my mother to say, what's going on with Steph? She's not eating. She's not looking well. What's happening? I remember my mother confronting me after that and saying that she hadn't registered it. She hadn't understood that it was getting to that level, whether it was because she sort of didn't want to know it or she just wasn't sure what kind of education at that point in the 90s do we really have around this stuff. I wasn't an after school special in her mind, although I used to get a lot of inspiration from those after school specials. And my parents at that time intervened and started to pick up on the ways in which I had really just eliminated a lot of my food. I remember my father coming home from work one day and bringing me home a cookie from the bakery at work that I'd always previously loved, and I wouldn't eat it. And I remember that he threw it across the room and it shattered in a million pieces from his frustration. And he screamed like, "Eat the damn cookie!" And I wouldn't. And
At this time, it was becoming more of an issue. My doctor was getting on board with this, was concerned about it. I had lost my period. So I was told that I couldn't play field hockey anymore, which was really important to me in high school. This was the thing that gave me a sense of who I was. It was an outlet, it was something I was good at. And I was told that I wouldn't be able to play the next coming fall. This is several years in at this point, unless I reached a certain weight. Well, that to me was like, it was this ultimatum that I understood to be like, okay, they're going to take away my restriction. Of course, I wouldn't have called it that, but they're going to take away this power that I have. They're going to take away the thing that keeps me acceptable, the thing that keeps me powerful. It was like my secret thing that I had done that had just become exposed to everybody else. Now everybody else knew about it and they were going to take it away from me. And I remember that there was also this moment inside where I registered the helplessness of that. And I remember, I mean, this is a little bit foggy for me because we're going back to, I'm 17 years old at this point. And I remember having a thought of like, I'm going to have to eat. And because I was so hungry underneath it, there was a part of me that was kind of like excited about it. There was this kind of part of me that was like, and it was a very subconscious part, but it was like, I'm going to have to eat. They're going to make me eat. And there was one part of me that was like, hell no. And there was another part of me that was like, whoo, like, and I think it opened up this dichotomy inside of me, which tends to be a theme for me, and probably initiated a really big black and white mindset of the control versus the out of control. It wasn't long after this because I wasn't managing to do it. So, I was like, okay, I'll do it. And I remember I would, I was like, I'll eat more when we go on vacation this summer. And I remember I got on vacation and I corrupted all of the recipes for the cookies so that I made them with, remember that the sugar equal? Like I would just pour equal into it as if it was a 1-to-1 ratio for sugar. And they didn't even congeal right. And I remember those were what I ate. So I wasn't reaching the goal. I wasn't able to do what I had to do to play field hockey. And so right before I would have had to make that choice or my parents would have had to make that choice around, is she going to enroll or not? I don't know what day of the week it was. I can see it though in my mind. It was a summer day and it was sunny out and it was hot. And I walked into my kitchen and I was alone. And I think we must have been having company. We must have been having maybe it was a birthday party. I don't know. And I remember that we had like chairs out on the deck and people were going to be coming over. It was going to be an outdoor kind of barbecue. And my mother had made this pasta salad. It was this tuna pasta salad, a cold salad. And it was huge. A huge bowl of it was sitting in my refrigerator. And I remember that I opened the refrigerator door and I looked at it and it had saran wrap over it. And this was something that like up until that point, it was like, obviously not. This isn't even something I would contemplate having. I didn't even have to try to not have it. It didn't require any willpower. It was just one of those things I didn't do. And I looked at it longer than I normally would. It didn't just like blow under my radar. It was lingering. It was calling to me. I remember seeing it through the saran wrap and I remember watching my hand go and peel the saran wrap back. And I don't even think I got a fork. I think that I just took one, like I took an elbow macaroni out of it and I watched myself bring it to my mouth and eat it. And I remember it was this like out of body experience. I wasn't not there. I was there, but I was watching myself do this thing that like a part of me was like, but this isn't happening. Like we don't do this. Like this is not occurring. And another part of me that was like, I can't stop. I think I did get a fork and I ate about half of the bowl, which was a significant amount of food. And it was certainly a significant amount of food at the time for me. And it was more than an entire day's worth of the calories. That was my norm at the time. And it was what I think of as my first binge. And I don't remember if I kept going after that. I really don't remember any more of that, except I remember that instance. And I remember that it initiated this binge restrict cycle that would take over my life for the next 25 years, or almost 25 years. I was incredulous that this had happened. And I don't even know if I went to the barbecue. I probably did because I probably had to, but I remember the amount of shame that I would feel and the amount of physical discomfort and fullness that I would get after these kinds of binges and what would become bigger binges was so horrifying to me. And I had no idea why. Where had all my willpower gone? Where had my all the knowing, I'd written it down in the journal, like, this is what we do. It's so easy. It's like, I didn't have access to it anymore. It was like that part of myself was a different, a different person that I identified with, but there's new part of me was like present, and I couldn't get back to the way that things had been before. And every day I would say it. I'd be like, tomorrow, tomorrow, like this is some kind of anomaly. This is a blip. Whatever is happening, it's going to stop tomorrow. And tomorrow I would always imagine that I would get back on. And always this was the idea. We're going to get back to what we just had access to. How far away could it be? Like this must be a phase. This must be just this moment in time. And every day would be a battle. And it was never, ever, ever easy again. Not ever. And that day never came where I found ease in that kind of restriction. And I understand at this point that this was where my body had said no. And whether that was because it would have happened anyway, or whether it was because there was that psychological invitation into this isn't safe anymore, and now we have to do something different, where that black and white mindset just flipped on, I don't know. But I never was the same since then. And I was never able to get back to a place where restricting was okay with my body. So this is around the age of 17 when my binge eating starts. And I go at this point through restriction and binging every day, one and then the other, one and then the other. So I would fast for a while, and then I would binge like out of control for a while. And it would just do this thing. And I'm just going to school at the time, like living and having a social life. And I hid this from my friends, but I told my parents because I was desperate for their help. And I said, something's happened to me and I can't stop eating. And they didn't really believe me, because they're like, you just have a disordered way of thinking about things. Like, you need to be eating. You just don't think you need to be eating. And they thought it was coming from more of that side of myself. I was, in fact, eating to points where it was absolutely physically painful. It was amounts of food that I would say to my parents, like, I ate an entire half gallon of ice cream in one sitting, and they would say, no, you didn't. Like, they just didn't believe that I was actually eating as much as I said I was eating. I would eat boxes of cereal at a time. I remember this one night I had to go to a key club meeting for school, and I couldn't go. And I remember saying to my mom, I can't go. I can't go. I can't get off the floor. And she thought I was exaggerating. And, I forget. I can't remember. I think I did end up going. I think she made me go. And I sat there in that pain, in that, like, when your stomach is just like, it's going to stretch and burst open. This is around the time I'm taking, sitting for the SATs to get into college. I wasn't present. In the name of just avoiding sensitive language on this platform, I did contemplate compensation by way of exercise, which I absolutely did, but I also tried other means, which I was not able to do from a traditional perspective at first. So I started to abuse at the time. I was in so much physical distress always. And at this time, my parents announced that we're moving my senior year to Massachusetts from New Jersey, which is 4 hours away. And that for my final year of high school, I'm going to be going to a new one. And I mean, after this, it was one of the worst periods of time in my life. I moved away. I was incredibly lonely. I had no desire to be making new friends. I was growing, I was gaining weight. I was trapped in this cycle of eating that I couldn't control and didn't have any understanding of what was going on. I was as depressed as I could get. I didn't get out of bed for a long time. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't write essays like for my English class. I remember, being in high school, and I couldn't think. I couldn't do the math. I couldn't write the essays. I did the work and I turned it in, but I don't think I learned anything during that time. My brain was mush. I remember wanting life to just like pause. I wished everything would just stop so that I could catch up. I guess the word is overwhelmed. But everything just kept moving. Like, life just kept going. And again, if you remember, the household environment was fast and loud and da da da. And I wanted everything to shut up. And I think that I also used food during that time as a way of doing that. It was like the world would stop when I ate. It was this hibernation, and it was where I could close my eyes and just like fall into the numbness of the food. I also don't want to overemphasize that, because you also have to remember that a lot of the binge response that I was experiencing at that time was a direct result of the years of restriction that had come before it. And it was at a time when my body was growing and developing and meant to be getting the calories and the fat that it needed, and it wasn't. And the rebound of that, my body's primal hunger in response to that was fast and furious. And then it started to exceed, like, it wasn't like, oh, I gained back the weight that I had lost and it stopped. It went beyond that. And it went beyond that because of the insurance policy here. That we learned this from the Minnesota starvation experiment, that even when you have made up the deficit, your body's like, yeah, I am not okay with just making up the deficit. Now we need insurance. This is also the premise for why weight cycling happens and we end up gaining more weight than we've lost after dieting. The body's like, yeah, I'm going to take some more this time. And so that was happening alongside of my significant amount of resistance to it, my mental restriction, this constant shaming of myself, this constant tomorrow, 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 it's going to be better. The more weight I was gaining, the more restrictive I wanted to be. So my mental restriction was exponential during this time. And I would try during the days to restrict only to be eating raw corn cobs at night. I remember eating frozen bread and I would pour syrup on it in the middle of the night. I remember taking corn cobs that weren't boiled yet and that my mom would have gotten from the store and eating them raw. Like, I would eat anything that I could. I remember telling my mom that this was going on. This was after we'd moved. And at this point, she did start to see that this was happening and that I was really, I think she started to pick up on, like, wait a minute, she's eating those corn cobs. Nobody else is doing that. And so she'd put a vacuum actually outside of my door once to catch me night eating, not to be cruel, but to be able to intervene so that she would hear the vacuum as I stumbled in the darkness out of my room, heading to the kitchen. And I remember the shame of that. I remember feeling like I'd been caught with my pants down, like that kind of, what's wrong with me? What is wrong with me? And that cadence of shame and binging and mentally restricting and physically restricting during the daytime was the hallmark of the next almost 20 years of my life. It didn't really change from that point. It remained throughout my 20s and 30s, a series of times when I could pull it together and times where I was able to get away with the white knuckling of the restriction and then the rebound. And that was where I did this in various spectrums across time, because there were certain periods of my life where things were darker and much, much more extreme. And then there were other periods where there was a little bit more lightning to it, but it never went away. I never, ever existed in a time in my 20s and 30s where I didn't have binging a part of it. It was never something that I never went, I would say, more than 2 weeks without binging. And many times it was daily. I did go to college. I did get married. I did have children. I went to grad school. I got jobs. None of those things were not impacted by the disorder. So I spent a ton of time in bed, a ton of time. My friends and my roommates all knew that that was something about me. Like, it was a quirk, kind of like, Stephanie's in bed again. This was something any roommate who knew me then or who'd been friends with me will tell you, like, yeah, that's just what Stephanie does. Would cancel plans all the time. I was never able to commit or be consistent in my responsibilities, which only made me feel worse. I was not able to sustain jobs many times, and I would lie. I would lie so much about, even things like, I'm sick today, I can't come in. And then other times I would lie about other things, which could be a whole nother episode. I mean, just the amount of lying you have to do to excuse yourself for behaviors that are essentially, they don't feel like choices because of these issues going on in the background, makes you just feel worse. I stole food. I stole food when I was desperate enough to do it. There were lots of friendships that became affected by my inconsistency, by my failure. I say failure, I catch myself, by my inability to be able to show up for people. It was viewed as selfishness. It was viewed as resistance. It was viewed as almost this intentional making my life harder. Nobody who was around me could understand it. None of them had been through it. None of my friends struggled with it. None of my family struggled with it. They looked at it. And I guess, I'm not blaming them, because if I haven't been through something, it might be very difficult for me to understand how something could be happening. But everybody at some point was like, this is on you, Stephanie. Like, you need to get yourself together. There was no discussion at any point in these years by doctors or professionals, because I was going to therapy. I was actually in an inpatient and an outpatient program for my eating. I left college for a couple of semesters to go get treatment. And nowhere in any of that was it put to me that my binge eating had been a product of my restriction. I mean, these things were not linked. It was blamed on emotions and emotions alone. And I was one of those, like, I was always very interested in self development and self help. So I wasn't afraid. And as you remember, in my family, I never learned to put emotions away. If anything, I felt them 10 times their size. I was not afraid of confronting my thoughts or my emotions. But none of that was helping me actually stop being able to binge. And so to me, I was just this broken human. I just thought I was so weak. And this was really what it was. You're so weak. And it went along with all of the thoughts I had about myself anyway, from being an introvert, from being shyer, from being somebody who kind of needed more space and time to process things. I just thought it was all part of my weakness, my body too. It was like your body is just the symbol of all that. Like you can't get anything together. You're not strong enough. And I have a lot of regrets in my life about the things that I didn't do, the things that I believed I couldn't do and so never tried to do because I believed myself to be a weak individual. I actually have an email from my therapist that I saw. I saw one therapist for many years. He was my favorite therapist. He really helped me in so many ways. It never impacted the eating, but he helped me get to know myself a lot better. But even he, in an email that I found a couple years ago, had written something to me to say that I was actually, I'm going to find it.
So I have actually found this email, and he had written to me, "You are the classic underachiever. You don't really challenge yourself." And I remember feeling so ashamed of that and feeling like, I mean, like, who wants to be called an underachiever? Um, and knowing what I know about myself now, it's like, no, that's a mischaracterization. That's not what this is. I'm not an underachiever. I'm not challenging myself. I'm stuck. This part really influences the way that I speak to clients now and the way that I coach, because this piece felt like, no, nobody's seeing this. Nobody's understanding that what I'm doing isn't not challenging myself. I'm frozen here. I don't have safety enough to move. And I knew that then, except I didn't. I was like, oh, I must be an underachiever. And I believed it. But I knew underneath, and I would be angry about it. I would be angry about this characterization of myself, which is how everyone was characterizing me at the time. And it's really what fuels my defense of the nervous system and understanding that, like, that is not a character thing. That's a nervous system thing. All right, but I digress again. I did want to explain one other element of this pattern before I got to my recovery at the age of 40 years old. And this was my bout with orthorexia, which developed in my 30s and happened as a result of anxiety. So up until my 30s, I was really quite more on the depressive side of things. Like I said, I was in bed a lot. I was not doing a lot. I was underachieving a lot. After I had kids, my first daughter was born when I was 31. I don't know. I can't explain this to you. I don't know what happened to me from a physiological point of view. It might have to do with the way the hormones ended up impacting me, but I flipped from depressive to highly anxious. I think I'd always had anxiety, but not like this. This was like always feeling a heart racing, and my thoughts wouldn't stop. They just got really racy. And I started worrying. And instead of reflecting, because previously in my depression, I had always been reflecting and I'd been very nostalgic. And I had always been looking at like what I did and what I didn't do. I was very backwards facing, past oriented. In my 30s, it flipped and I stopped. I kind of abandoned that. I was like, never mind my past. I'm over it. And I was future focused and I was always worried about what was going to happen. And I couldn't stop planning for things and wanting to perfect things. It was around this time, it was right after I had my second daughter, that, I had gotten more into like the natural and organic foods and things like that for my kids. And I started to identify and overattach to the blogs at the time that I was reading around like how to make homemade food for your children and how not to feed them processed foods and these kinds of things. And at that point, it was more to my kids. It wasn't that I was doing it for myself, but I was only feeding my daughters the purest of things. And then after when my second daughter was born, I started to experience symptoms that were later diagnosed as chronic Lyme disease, but it took 2 years to get that diagnosis. I'm still unsure about really what this is, but I started to have all these symptoms that I honestly thought I was dying. We checked everything for autoimmune.
Everything was clear. I was like, I just thought I was dying. And so, in order to cope with that, I started to be like, well, maybe I need to eat the way that I'm feeding my children. And I got into like tons of clean eating and I went to all these specialists, and not a one of them asked me if I was restricting my food or anything about my eating history. Meanwhile, I still was doing lots and lots of disordered things with food, but now we added on to it an obsession with healthy eating. So it wasn't just about calories and weight management and compensation cycles and obsession. It was also now adding in the layer of healthy and my addiction to health that then developed. And this was also getting applauded along the way. Every single specialist I saw was like, you're doing everything right. You're doing everything right. But nobody ever asked me about the relationship I had to all of that, my anxiety and the ways in which I was obsessed with getting the right foods or eating the right amount, and obviously the ongoing binging and compensation cycles that were happening all along the way, including during my pregnancies. So the doctors I was seeing were like, okay, you need to eliminate gluten, you need to eliminate dairy, you need to eliminate nightshades, you need to eliminate oxalates, to the point where nothing I ate felt safe. There was at one point I was down to eating about 14 foods only. And my symptoms were still there. And I just kept eating those 14 foods. And I went through all these protocols where I would have to eat organ meat and beef tallow, and I couldn't have any kind of carbohydrates or grains. It was a gut health protocol that I went, and nothing helped. My symptoms were just as strong. I don't know if I had seen some impact, if it had been like, okay, having all this restriction actually takes your symptoms away, maybe it would have landed differently, but it was more just this reinforcement that control, 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 and you're still not getting any control, which only made me want more control, which made me become more controlling, which inevitably, I think, made my symptoms higher and higher. This went on for 5 years, and I lost a lot of weight during that time. I thought that I had overcome my disorder, and at that point decided, oh, the reason why I've struggled for so long is because I've been eating processed foods for so long. And that's really the problem. And now I've cracked this code. And really, all you needed all this time was clean eating. But I also was like, yeah, but you're still having these binges and you're still really obsessed with it. But that's just a blip. That must be habit. That must be part of like old stuff you still have to fix and outgrow. Because my weight dropped, I assumed I was recovering. And this is another one of those common misconceptions that, like, if you lose weight, that's the sign of recovery. That's the sign of health. It's not. Your behaviors are. What I wasn't factoring in was you're still, in fact, you're more obsessed than ever. You're more anxious than ever. Your life is closing in again the same way it did when you were a teenager, where you're not going out because you're afraid of food. And you're still compensating and you're still having binges. They were just on healthy foods. I never would put anything in my mouth, even when I was binging, that was processed. But that didn't mean that I wasn't binging a lot on things like coconut flour bread, almond flour cookies, gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free, nut-free chocolate chip bags, grass-fed and organic ice cream. I mean, I was still very much, even within the rules, having major, major restrictions and binges. As I approached about 38, 39 years old, I started to get into intermittent fasting. I had already dabbled in keto, which is something that my brother got into really strongly. He was keto for 7 years. He is no longer, but at the time, he was very much successful, quote unquote, on that diet. And I had reduced my carbs many, many times, which made my binges really, really big. But then when I found out about intermittent fasting, I was like, that's a way to do this. And I got into that. When I tell you that nothing has made my binges more strong and powerful and overwhelming than intermittent fasting, there's no hesitation I have in saying that. I became at that point more powerless than I had ever been, going back to probably when I was 17. Of course, I did not make the association at the time that that's what was going on, but I see now in retrospect that the fasting itself was putting my body into such a state of emergency based on my entire history that it was pulling out all the stops, and my binges were reaching levels that were scaring me. They were exhausting me. I was beginning to feel like I no longer had the capacity to work. I barely had the capacity to parent. And it was around this time that I got onto Instagram. At the time, I had been on Instagram as a sugar detox coach, but I started exploring other kinds of accounts on Instagram. I honestly don't remember how they came across my algorithm, but somewhere along the line, I saw somebody's account. I think it was Isabel Fox and Duke, who landed somewhere in my scroll, and she was talking about this anti-diet concept. She was talking about restriction causing binge eating. And when I saw her stuff and then I found her website, I just devoured it. It was one of those things where, when you read something or you hear from something and you're like, oh, it's like speaking to your soul. There's something about whatever this person is saying that connects. You're like, that is me. That is me. This is how I felt about Isabel Fox and Duke. And then much soon after that, it was Caroline Dooner, who wrote a book called The Effort Diet, which became an extremely powerful influence in my recovery. These were the original voices that I knew of on Instagram at that time. And I started paying attention. I started reading it. I didn't change my behaviors, but I started understanding and learning more about this conversation that people were having online about dieting and its impact, and restriction and its impact, and even healthy eating and its impact. Christy Harrison was another voice in the field that was talking about wellness culture as not a responsible thing to do, but actually as another mask of disorder. I had never contemplated things like this. And I honestly, at the time, was still pretty hesitant about acknowledging them, because to look towards the things they were saying was to completely dismantle 25 years of my life's efforts. It was to take away philosophy that formed the basis of my identity. If I wasn't going to pursue weight loss, or if these things that are helping me become my best self were actually hurting me, what? Like, what was I going to do with that? That was going to turn my world upside down. But I couldn't look away. It was like I couldn't not keep learning. And again, my behaviors didn't change. And I would say that I ingested this information for about a year. I scrolled it. I still sugar detoxed. I still was a clean eating fanatic. I still intermittently fasted. I went into one more round of intermittent fasting in the spring of 2019, just before my 40th birthday. And my binges once again became overwhelming and all consuming. At that point, I had been ingesting this information on social media for about a year. And I picked up the Effort Diet book, and I read it start to finish. And then I closed it and I read it again. And I read it 3 times, and I read it quickly. And then I got the audiobook, and I was a traveling OT at the time, and I would listen in my car to that audiobook over and over and over again. There were certain sections I would play and play and play again. And it was like I wasn't getting tired of it. Each version of the words landed, and I couldn't get enough. I don't remember making this decision. I don't remember being like, right, okay, so on my 40th birthday, which was coming up in June, I'm going to do this. Like, I really don't remember what made me do it, but I know that at that point, I had taken in the information enough, and it had resonated with me enough, and I was exhausted enough that I had this thought in my head that you're going to be 40. You're going to enter your 40s just the same way that you entered your 30s, just the same way that you entered your 20s, just the same way that every single year on your birthday, you tell yourself this is the year that you're going to get smaller or do this or that. And every year looks exactly the same. And you're expecting to start this all over again. You're going to enter another decade of life. You're going to do the exact same things you've always done with a different name on top: intermittent fasting, keto, low carb, whatever it is. You're going to do all of that, and nothing's going to change. And you're going to expect that it will. And that's the definition of insanity. And I knew it. And all of a sudden I got it. I was like, that's what I have been doing. And that's what I will continue to do. And it was like, you can say that, like everybody know, I'd heard that before, but I knew it. It was like this embodiment of understanding that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. I saw it clear as day. And on my birthday that year, when I turned 40 years old, I have a picture of that day. And the picture doesn't betray how terrified I actually was. But I had cake. I had birthday cake that my mother made, that was made with ingredients that she picked. And I had a lot of it. And I didn't compensate for it. I didn't compensate for it. And I knew from that day forward that I knew that I needed to challenge myself not to compensate. And this was my version of an all-in process. I didn't even know that terminology, I don't think, at the time. But I was like, it was black and white, to be honest with you. It was a very black and white way of me saying, from now on, for a period of time, and I said for a year, for the next year until you're 41, you're going to eat what you eat and not compensate for it. And that is a whole nother episode of how that actually looked and what that means and why I don't recommend that approach actually to everybody. But for me, I am now 46 and a half and I recovered. I broke the cycle. I did the different thing. So that wasn't easy. And of course, I just wrapped that up in like 2 minutes time. And that doesn't include all of the tears and all of the doubt and all of the fear and all of the weight gain and all of that part of the messy middle of it. But the short of it is I changed everything about the way I approached food and I did recover. And I then became a coach because I said to myself, if I ever figure out a way to get through this, having come from a place of feeling like there's no way that I will ever recover, it was my life. Anything I knew about myself was through the lens of my disorder. That I would need to help other people do it too, because I always felt like if I can do it, I had that thought like if I can do it, anybody could do it. I think it's a very tricky thing to say. But what I meant by that was this has been a pretty significant life experience. My disorder wasn't casual. I had a lot of barriers. I had a lot of depression. I had extreme amounts of inner turmoil and extremely low self-esteem. And through that this happened, that I was able to recover, just to me, I still have such deep respect for that part, that version of myself that got through it, that did it. Like sometimes I look back at her and I think, I'm really impressed. I'm really impressed at her courage. I'm really impressed that she could do something so drastic that even now to me seems scary. Like, could I do that now if I was called to? I'd like to think I could, but it was a really huge, huge leap of faith that all I can say about it is that I knew that I needed to do it. I understood it at that moment in time as like, you're not going to heal if you don't go this way. Whew, yeah. I feel all of a sudden this vulnerability hangover, like, all right. I feel like I should be saying more about, okay, and this is how I recovered, and here's all the caveats about it. But this episode was meant to be the story. And so I share the story in case any of you resonate with pieces of it, or it helps anybody conceptualize the way I talk about things and why I talk about them the way that I do. And also to note that I know I'm going to edit this episode later and be like, you forgot to say this, and this. And there's no way I could get all of that into a single episode. But that is the timeline. That is the summarization on a grand scale of what my life looked like up until I did recover at 40 years of age. If you have any questions or if you have any thoughts that you would like to share, you can put them in the YouTube comments below, or you can visit my website and email me from there to suggest podcast episode topics or anything that came up during this particular episode that feels like it warrants another exploration. I am happy to share. I am not afraid to share. I am honestly, truly, really not afraid of this kind of vulnerability. Other kinds, yes. But I'm not afraid to share my story. And so I'm an open book on this. And I believe that it's what helps people feel more connected and less alone. That is my passion. That is what I aim to do in this work. And so I hope it has helped someone out there.